October 12, 1942, Ironbottom Sound. Humid air clung to the skin before sunrise, the sea smelling of cordite and hot oil as a thin ground swell slapped at dark hulls. In the black hour after midnight, long before the sun burned the mist from the water, the first American radar pulses probed the haze. Operators aboard the cruiser Helena had already fixed ranges, while the Japanese column felt for bearings by eye alone. Minutes later, the silence shattered. Tight salvos from 5-inch 38 guns began to walk across the water with the mechanical precision of a metronome, 15 and more rounds a minute, the flashes strobing low clouds as tracers hissed and ricocheted. Lookouts on Sendai strained through binoculars and caught the lean shapes of American destroyers, weaving at more than 35 knots, their silhouettes unnervingly uniform, their directors steady, their patterns disciplined. To men on Shirayuki and Murakumo, it seemed as if the enemy had reached into some hidden warehouse and pulled out a line of identical killers, each stamped with flawless weld seams and the same batteries and tubes. By dawn, the smoke thinned and the light turned milky, revealing what rumors would later magnify: fresh, angular hulls that Japanese officers whispered belonged to the newest American type, Fletcher-class, arriving already drilled, bristling with 5 single 5-inch mounts, 10 torpedo tubes, and radar-guided fire control that had found targets in the dark. Whether every silhouette they saw that morning truly was a Fletcher mattered less than the impression they carried back up the chain. The United States could lose ships and still put more to sea with alarming speed. The parts interchangeable, the workmanship standardized, the crews trained to the same template. As word spread through mess decks and wardrooms, a question dug in like a splinter. Were the Americans building destroyers the way Detroit built cars? To answer it, we have to step ashore, into the yards where this new rhythm of war was forged. Late autumn of 1936 found quiet ripples of concern circulating through the halls of the Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair, where engineers examined reports from fleet exercises in the Pacific and noted how long it took to refit worn destroyers after weeks at sea. By 1937, planners conceded that any future confrontation with Japan would unfold across thousands of miles, straining not merely crews, but the industrial arteries feeding them. The United States possessed ample resources, yet coordination was uneven. Steel arrived in irregular batches, machinery orders varied between classes, and hull components were still shaped by craftsmen, whose individual touch created subtle differences that slowed repairs. When the Mahon-class and Porter-class destroyers completed trials, inspectors found that no 2 engine rooms were identical. Piping routes changed from ship to ship, and spare parts had to be custom machined. Each inefficiency stood like a small fence post on a vast plain, individually harmless, together restricting the speed of expansion. In early 1938, the Bureau of Ships, newly formed from a merger meant to streamline oversight, issued directives calling for repeatable patterns, standardized fittings, and interchangeable assemblies. Commercial firms were encouraged to bid on components using blueprints that no longer invited creative flair, but demanded exact duplication. Bethlehem Steel, reading industrial journals from Detroit, began to experiment with welding sequences inspired by automobile body lines. Bath Iron Works reorganized its yard workflow so hull plates, turbines, and electrical systems arrived at timed intervals rather than whenever craftsmen finished them. By the summer of 1939, convoy protection demands from Europe sharpened Washington's appetite for destroyers. Though appropriations remained cautious, everything changed on July 19, 1940. The signing of the Two-Ocean Navy Act authorized an unprecedented surge, more than 100 new destroyers, with funds stretching to battleships, carriers, and auxiliary vessels. Newspapers marveled at the numbers, but naval attachés from Japan read between the lines. Their reports from Washington that autumn described railcars delivering steel to coastal yards with uncanny punctuality, warehouses filling with prefabricated bulkheads, and turbine sets arriving like clockwork. They warned Tokyo that American industry seemed to be borrowing not only the spirit, but the mechanisms of Dearborn's assembly lines. Yet senior commanders dismissed the concern, believing that American crews, softened, they argued, by consumer comforts, would falter long before these hulls tasted battle. Through 1941, Even as neutrality patrols edged closer to open conflict, the blueprint for a new destroyer matured in design offices. Simplified piping runs, larger magazines, dual-purpose guns, and a power plant arranged for mass production. If approved, this class would leverage every industrial lesson learned. Modular components, stamped fittings, welded seams, and systems interchangeable from keel to mast. The pulse of American industry beat faster, turning ore into plates, plates into frames, and frames into the promise of hulls not yet named. With the storm of war approaching, the Navy prepared to unveil a destroyer that would not merely fight, but be built in numbers that astonished friend and foe alike. Next would come the innovations that defined how those ships performed. Once they left the slips and steamed into hostile waters. January 1941 arrived with the scent of sea. Brine and inked blueprints as naval architects in Washington spread draft after draft across long tables, aligning every line toward a single goal, a destroyer able to range across the Pacific without constant refitting. The Fletcher blueprint that emerged weighed in at roughly 2,100 tons standard. Its hull stretched to accommodate fuel stores that granted nearly 6,500 nautical miles of endurance at cruising speed. To push that steel at nearly 36 knots, engineers selected General Electric geared turbines coupled to high-pressure boilers, their arrangement simplified for mass production and streamlined maintenance. 5.5-inch 38-caliber guns crowned the deck in single mounts, each equally comfortable hurling shells toward aircraft or surface targets with precise elevation control, while a set of quadruple torpedo tubes lurked amidships, ready to answer a sudden surface threat. Early prototypes of SG surface search radar promised night eyes sharper than any lookout, and discussions within the Bureau of Ordnance hinted at fire control directors that could calculate bearings faster than human intuition. The hull itself transitioned to all welded seams, shedding weight and eliminating rivet lines that once demanded armies of skilled hands. The freed deck space welcomed 40mm Bofors mounts and clusters of 20mm Shurlikons whose bark would soon become familiar to crews facing diving aircraft. Standardization rippled through the design like current through a fresh circuit. Electrical panels matched coast to coast, piping runs traveled predictable routes, and boiler configurations followed the same geometry whether assembled in Massachusetts or New Jersey. Workers at Bath Iron Works, Kearney, and Staten Island lowered prefabricated sections from cranes with practiced rhythm, assembling destroyers as though they were oversized chassis in an open-air factory, each frame slotting into the next with minimal adjustment. Japanese intelligence officers, watching these developments from embassy windows and naval journals, worried about rumors of radar-directed night fighting that might blunt their cherished Type 93 long-lance torpedo ambushes. Yet staff officers in Tokyo dismissed the reports as embellishment, insisting that mass production shortcuts would doom the American hulls to mechanical frailty. As the keels stacked through mid-1941 and engines hummed on test stands, the U.S. Navy prepared to measure theory against reality, a test that would begin under the smoke-darkened skies of the Pacific after Pearl Harbor's opening blow. December 7, 1941, shattered the quiet calculations of slow expansion, and in the smoke curling above Battleship Row, the United States pivoted from peacetime caution to emergency mobilization. In the weeks that followed, telegrams hammered through naval districts instructing yards to accelerate every timetable. Federal Shipbuilding in New Jersey expanded its welding crews by hurriedly training local labor, while Bath Iron Works in Maine extended shift rotations so sparks flew across steel throughout the night. Prefabrication lines surged because the Navy had already gathered standardized steel plate inventories months earlier, and these cached resources now formed the bones of new hulls without delay. Boiler rooms, electrical panels, and machinery spaces rolled out of warehouses in modular assemblies, each tagged for the next hull on the schedule. By May 1942, DD-445, soon commissioned as USS Fletcher, slipped down the ways, and behind her, an almost rhythmic procession of near-identical destroyers waited only weeks, not months, for their turn. Japanese commanders at Truk and Rabaul received intelligence summaries that spoke of shimmering rows of angular destroyers appearing along American piers faster than anticipated losses could diminish them. Reports whispered, that these repetitive hull shapes might ease training, allowing manuals, drills, and maintenance routines to be replicated ship after ship, turning familiarity into lethality. In San Diego and Norfolk, radar training schools proliferated, teaching operators to read SG returns in darkness that once masked Japanese torpedo attacks. Analysts who had grown up with artisanal warship construction struggled to reconcile these new numbers, suspecting that the American yards had found a way to pour warships as steadily as factories cast automobile frames. Through mid-1942, as the battered Pacific Fleet clung to the Solomon Islands, fresh destroyers arrived with the confidence of ships born in rhythm. Soon their steel would echo with incoming fire in the narrow channels and reef-lined approaches, where the first true tests of mass production would unfold, driving attention toward how doctrine and technology would shape the brutal night battles ahead. August 1942 settled over Guadalcanal with heat that tasted of wet earth and rotting vegetation, and each evening the sun bled into the slot north of Savo Island, where the sea turned black and the horizon vanished. Into this darkness steamed the first waves of radar-equipped American destroyers, among them USS Fletcher and USS O'Bannon, their SG sets ready to paint faint echoes across the void. Japanese Kagero-class destroyers, trained for swift runs and ambush torpedo attacks, slipped through narrow channels at high speed, trusting lookouts and intuition. But now American operators tracked returns at ranges of roughly 15 to 18 nautical miles, plotting bearings long before moonlight could glint off a masthead. When the guns spoke, they did so in measured cadence. The 5-inch 38 mounts hurled shells, whose arcs were calculated by directors unhindered by smoke or glare. Japanese officers, conditioned to own the darkness through their famed Type 93 torpedoes, found themselves marked on unseen scopes and answered by salvos that came from beyond human sight. As the campaign ground toward late November, pressure along the slot climaxed at the Battle of Tassafaronga on the 30th. American cruisers suffered grievously when long-lance torpedoes found their mark, leaving shattered plating and flooded engine rooms. Yet reports filtered back to Rabaul that U.S. destroyers had coordinated fire through blinding smoke, maintaining a tempo that unnerved seasoned captains. Some lookouts compared the rhythm of radar-directed salvos to being hunted by machines, their movements predicted before they finished turning the helm. Meanwhile, American engineers on the surviving ships logged boiler performance curves and weld strain under sudden acceleration, pleased to find resilience consistent with their standardized designs. December brought fresh hulls to battered task forces, the repetition of silhouettes along American piers feeding rumors in Tokyo that the United States possessed inexhaustible workshops. Guadalcanal proved that radar, interchangeable components, and repeatable crew training could erode even veteran advantages. As analysts sifted captured fragments of equipment and intelligence officers scoured reports, Axis planners shifted from curiosity to alarm, turning their attention to how these destroyers were being built with such relentless speed. Early 1943 brought a chill of unease to the offices of the Imperial Japanese Navy's intelligence bureaus, where clerks shuffled through increasingly thick dossiers of intercepted photographs and battle reports. Across the Pacific, American destroyers seemed to multiply with a peculiar sameness, silhouettes matching, deck fittings arranged with uncanny precision, and radar masts carried in identical fashion from hull to hull. Analysts concluded that the United States must have embraced industrial assembly principles, abandoning artisanal craftsmanship in favor of workflows once confined to automobile factories. German naval attachés in Tokyo echoed the concern, forwarding notes that compared these destroyers to the explosively expanding Liberty ship program, which had already authorized more than 2,700 standardized hulls. If America could churn out merchant vessels by the score, what prevented similar techniques from shaping sleek warships? Serial hull numbers rose faster than Axis planners had predicted, hinting that multiple yards were receiving streams of standardized parts through rail networks, running from Pittsburgh's steel mills to coastal slipways. Intelligence officers questioned how enough trained welders could be found to sustain such a pace. Yet reports from neutral observers described ranks of newly trained workers, many of them women, bending arcs of blue-white flame across steel under the guidance of simplified diagrams. In July's wreckage near Kula Gulf, Japanese divers recovered fragments of piping, whose angles and weld junctions repeated precisely from one shattered destroyer to another. That uniformity, they realized, meant logistics officers could stock identical spares, and repair crews could work without relearning every layout. Briefs forwarded to Tokyo warned that such modular consistency shortened training cycles and smoothed battlefield maintenance. German U-boat commanders, stalking Atlantic convoys, recorded escorts vectoring aircraft and patterning depth charges with radar-guided method. Each encounter felt less like an artisanal craft and more like an industrial rhythm. Sabotage and reconnaissance proved futile. America's vast geography placed shipyards far beyond reach of enemy bombers, and rails ran uninterrupted behind oceans. As Axis intelligence failed to grasp the full system behind this steel tide, Washington's planners quietly refined it further, preparing to reveal the sprawling logistics web that made such astonishing production possible. By mid-1943, the explanation for America's swelling destroyer fleets was rooted not in secret weaponry, but in industrial logic. At coastal yards, engineers broke hulls into prefabricated blocks, assembling frames, bulkheads, and piping indoors where weather could not steal hours from the schedule. When complete, cranes swung these massive sections into dry docks like pieces of a steel puzzle, welding seams along lines predetermined months earlier in drafting rooms. Bath Iron Works began launching ships with such regularity that yard workers joked the tide clock had become their foreman. At Bethlehem Steel's Staten Island yard, boiler rooms and turbine foundations were installed according to standardized blueprints, eliminating the improvisations that once tangled engineering logs. Where artisans once hammered and shaped steel by hand, power tools carved fittings to identical profiles. Central schedulers, guided by colored charts and punch cards, ensured no slipway sat idly while another drowned in backlog. Across the rail networks of New England, General Electric shipped turbines southward on predictable timetables, the locomotive's whistles marking the heartbeat of production. American abundance kept these arteries flowing. Japanese rail lines, throttled by resource shortages and air raids, could only envy such continuity. Reports reaching Tokyo described American destroyer hull counts entering the hundreds, a figure that shattered pre-war estimates projecting no more than 50 per annum. Maintenance logs later captured aboard damaged ships revealed consistent part dimensions, brackets that matched from hull to hull, valves that threaded without custom grinding, electrical conduits that bent at the same angles. Repairs that once required days became matters of hours. As interchangeable destroyers appeared in both the Atlantic and Pacific, their presence hemmed in U-boats, shielded troop convoys, and hunted surface raiders with radar-directed efficiency. For Axis crews, encountering the same silhouette in distant oceans amplified a creeping dread. These machines were the product of a system, not a workshop. And that system was still accelerating. The next chapter would reveal how this steel tide exerted crushing pressure across multiple theaters, reshaping maritime strategy wherever it rolled forward. By the closing months of 1943, the Fletcher-class destroyers had spread like a lattice of steel across the world's oceans, proving that their virtues were not confined to the narrow waters of the Solomons. In the frigid Aleutians, where fog smothered visibility and sleet hissed across decks, their radar suites pierced weather that would have blinded older pickets. Crews aboard ships such as USS Hull and USS Johnston threaded through grey rollers to harass submarine contacts, accelerating and pivoting with a nimbleness that belied their 2,000-ton frames. Far to the south and west, other Fletchers screened carrier task forces striking the Marshall Islands, their 5-inch 38 guns chattering at incoming aircraft as flight decks launched raids against Kwajalein and Eniwetok. Logs from USS Fletcher recorded tight air defense formations, radar ranges updating in steady increments, while directors slewed to track dive bombers nosing out of the sun. Across the Atlantic, destroyers built to the same blueprint patrolled convoys stitching together the industrial lifeline to Britain. Radar detection of U-boats before torpedoes left their tubes drove down shipping losses, forcing German commanders to lament that identical American silhouettes seemed to grow from the sea faster than new submarines could leave Bremen's yards. Standardized anti-aircraft mounts, yielded consistent kill probabilities in climates ranging from Arctic cold to equatorial heat, allowing crews to transfer without relearning their tools. At dawn, some destroyers lobbed shells against coastal fortifications. By afternoon, the same hulls escorted tankers through submarine-infested waters, validating the multi-purpose doctrine that shaped their design. Through the summer of 1944, Japanese sailors glimpsed gleaming deck plating and freshly installed radar arrays on hulls that had not existed months earlier. Rumors whispered that the Americans built destroyers like consumer goods, interchangeable and endless. Each sighting compounded the psychological burden already pressing on Axis crews. Ahead loomed the next phase of the Pacific Campaign, where this tide of standardized steel would meet entrenched defenses and reveal the full weight of industrialized firepower. Late summer 1944 unfolded across the Pacific, with a quiet dread that spread through the Imperial Navy's lower decks. At forward anchorages, Japanese sailors watched American destroyers enter in groups of 5 or more, their hull numbers ascending in neat succession like pages torn from an endless ledger. Rumor insisted that losses could be replaced within weeks. Some claimed new ships arrived so quickly that their paint still gleamed against the salt air. In wardrooms, officers struggled to reassure crews who whispered about radar's invisible reach and the uncanny sameness of American silhouettes, each one bristling with freshly tuned antennas and identical gun directors. The immaculate weld lines noted along shattered wreckage only intensified fears. Such perfection suggested a manufacturing base immune to fatigue. Meanwhile, American morale swelled. Sailors stepping aboard brand-new vessels found familiar switchboards, boiler arrangements, and gunnery controls, their standardized training slipping into place without hesitation. The ease with which they operated advanced radar and coordinated formations bred quiet confidence. In June 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Fletcher-class destroyers formed the armored rim of carrier task forces. Their layered anti-aircraft fire, guided by radar plots and computing directors, cut attacking aircraft from the sky in a storm so dense that Japanese pilots later wrote that the horizon flashed like a furnace. Captured diaries described despair at the seemingly endless line of escorts that guarded each carrier, warning that no opening existed for a clean dive. Behind those guns lay logistics made effortless by consistency. Spare parts arrived in predictable crates, and repair officers could walk into a fresh engine room as if returning to their own. As pressure mounted, Japanese destroyer crews entered night battles taut with tension, their once fluid maneuvers marred by hesitation. Each encounter fed a growing belief that they faced not just ships but a system, one that built steel faster than courage could rebuild resolve. Ahead waited the climactic battles, where this industrial uniformity and radar mastery would collide with the last fierce resistance of a cornered navy. October 25, 1944, dawned over the central Philippines beneath bruised clouds and a restless sea, as the battle off Samar thrust Fletcher-class destroyers into one of the most desperate actions of the war. When Admiral Kurita's center force burst from morning haze, battleships and heavy cruisers towered over the comparatively light American escorts, shielding vulnerable escort carriers. Yet ships like USS Johnston, USS Hole, and USS Heermann accelerated toward the threat rather than away from it, their standardized machinery layouts allowing engineers to push boilers to peak output without hesitation. Radar screens aboard these destroyers painted the oncoming formation in stark angular clusters. Fire control directors translated the data into rapid salvos that splashed around the lead cruisers, buying seconds for carrier decks to scramble aircraft. Torpedo crews, trained on identical tube arrangements across the class, swung mounts and fired spreads that forced Japanese columns to sheer off course, fracturing formations just as guns sought to settle on range. Reports from heavy cruiser Haguro later noted bewilderment among her officers. They had expected American destroyers to screen timidly at distance, but instead encountered vessels that attacked again and again, as if replacement hulls waited beyond the horizon. Smoke screens billowed behind the darting silhouettes, and radar-guided gunnery neutralized traditional surprise tactics, stripping the Japanese of their favored night edge. Meanwhile, the industrial arteries of the American fleet flexed. Ammunition shipments reached forward bases at Leyte with predictable regularity, and standardized spare parts allowed repair crews to restore damaged ships in days. Kurita's hesitation, fed by torpedo wakes, splintering salvos, and the nagging fear that more escorts lurked behind the smokescreens, shaped the entire engagement, prompting a retreat that spared the carriers. Heavy casualties fell upon some destroyer crews, yet the broader class endured, with dozens more hulls joining the fleet before their losses could erode combat power. From this point onward, American destroyers ceased to be a surprising nuisance. They became an expected wall of steel and radar, forcing Japanese planners into increasingly desperate defensive improvisations. Ahead, the Pacific would tighten into close quarters, where every new arrival carried the unmistakable stamp of an industry accelerating toward victory. By early 1945, the Fletcher-class destroyers that had once swept confidently across the Pacific began to reveal the consequences of their lean, aggressive design. Crews reported that concentrated shellfire from heavy cruisers could riddle thin deck plating, tearing open compartments and igniting ready-use ammunition. Kamikaze attacks off Luzon and later Okinawa exploited these vulnerabilities, diving toward exposed superstructures where armor was never meant to withstand explosive weight. In response, shipyard crews added additional 40mm Bofors mounts wherever deck space allowed, thickening the curtain of fire that greeted incoming aircraft. Welders reinforced sections of plating above machinery spaces, and onboard teams strung improvised splinter shields around radio antennas and communication trunks. Radar improvements brought new challenges. Early SG sets, susceptible to clutter from choppy seas, required revised operator training and signal filtering techniques. Manuals were updated fleet-wide, ensuring that lessons from one radar room echoed across dozens of others. Tropical heat exacerbated another weakness. Engine rooms, already cramped, reached punishing temperatures that threatened crew endurance. Ventilation ducts were widened, and auxiliary fans appeared along passageways that had once relied on natural airflow. Japanese engineers studying damage reports from captured photographs noted exposed steering gear on several ships, realizing that standardized layouts allowed a single vulnerability to echo across the class. American yards soon added splinter protection to rudder linkages and critical communication conduits. Depth charge projectors multiplied along some hulls, as submarine tactics grew bolder near transit lanes. When kamikaze strikes tore into picket stations around Okinawa, losses hurt, but replacement vessels arrived without disrupting the battle line, their familiar silhouettes filling gaps before fatigue could take hold. These adaptations grew from a principle the enemy could not duplicate: iterative upgrades applied simultaneously across an entire fleet. One ship's scars became another's modifications. Japanese planners, facing shattered supply chains and an exhausted workforce, recognized they lacked the industrial agility to respond in kind. As the war's final months loomed, the Fletchers steamed forward, their refinements shaping decisions about future armament, internal protection, and crew habitability. Those considerations would cast a long shadow into post-war design philosophy, setting the stage for a navy increasingly defined by rapid evolution rather than singular perfection. August 1945 brought the sudden quiet of surrender, but the silhouettes of Fletcher-class destroyers did not fade with the smoke that drifted over a defeated Pacific. Their hulls, proven by years of combat and continuous adaptation, formed the backbone of a post-war fleet, now shifting toward new threats. Naval architects found that the same robust framing which once absorbed near misses and patched battle scars could also accept heavier radar arrays, improved fire control computers, and the emerging suite of anti-submarine mortars and homing torpedoes. Modernization programs threaded new wiring looms through familiar passageways, and updated sonar domes hung beneath bows that had once hunted aircraft instead of nuclear-powered adversaries. Dozens of these destroyers, still sound in their welded seams, transferred to Allied navies across Europe and Asia, where standardized components allowed foreign crews to learn their systems with remarkable speed. In classrooms from Naples to Seoul, instructors could predict the angle of a conduit bend or the placement of a fuse panel, because every Fletcher was built from the same industrial vocabulary. Retired Japanese officers, poring over wartime logs in the uneasy calm that followed capitulation, marveled at how assembly line efficiency had turned a destroyer into more than a single fighting ship. It had become a strategic instrument, replicable, repairable, and standardized in a manner older naval schools had dismissed as impossible. Analysts concluded that America's application of automotive logic had upended assumptions about naval warfare, shifting emphasis from singular craftsmanship to relentless iteration. Welding techniques refined on wartime slipways carried into peacetime yards, lowering maintenance costs and granting hulls greater longevity. Radar integration, once a novelty, evolved into doctrine, pressing early detection and layered defense into the very language of maritime planning. As Cold War tension tightened, the lessons of the Fletcher era seeded continuous production pipelines, modular upgrades, and the conviction that industrial momentum could deter aggression long before a gun fired. Former adversaries, now cautious observers, recognized that industrial capacity, not only tactical brilliance, had tipped the balance. And so the legacy looped back to that first battlefield shock, the moment enemy lookouts glimpsed immaculate, factory-fresh destroyers cutting across contested seas, realizing that they fought not just ships, but a system capable of building them faster than fear could fade. Decades later, when the trade winds ruffle the stillness over Ironbottom Sound and the tide curls around coral-dusted wrecks, it is still possible to imagine the shock that rippled through Japanese lookouts who first glimpsed those sleek American destroyers emerging from the pre-dawn haze in 1942. Their silhouettes, crisp and uniform against the grey morning light, hinted at something deeper than naval bravado. They were born of factories that pulsed like beating hearts, welding together a logic of replacement, refinement, and relentless iteration. Each standardized compartment, each interchangeable valve, testified to a nation not merely fighting a war, but manufacturing its outcome. For Japanese sailors raised on the belief that attrition might bend the enemy's will, the sight of fresh hulls arriving within weeks shattered the hope that sinking ships would ever slow the American tide. For American crews, stepping onto a deck that smelled of new paint and polished steel brought a confidence rooted not just in equipment, but in the knowledge that every panel and pathway had been shaped by lessons learned across an entire fleet. Over time, the identical profiles that once sparked hushed speculation became symbols of industrial inevitability, marking a turning point in naval history. Long after the guns fell silent, admirals and engineers concluded that oceans could be decided by efficiency, standardization, and modular design as surely as by courage. And so the legacy of the Fletcher-class destroyers endures, not only in wrecks resting beneath these quiet waters, but in every fleet shaped by assembly line logic, fulfilling the realization that began when Axis observers could not believe the United States had learned to build destroyers like cars.